Hello everyone, welcome to Chapter 4. In Chapter 4, we're going to be talking about the tissues. So let's dive right in. So tissues are basically just groups of cells that perform a similar function or a common function. So we've talked about individual body cells and how there are over 200 and 250 cell types of cells, each performing their own function. Well, when groups of them get together and are similar in structure, they become tissues. A person who studies tissues is a histologist, so the study of tissues is histology, and there are 4 basic types of epithelial tissue, and we'll be going through these through this chapter. There's epithelial, connective, muscle, and nervous tissue, and then we're going to define what subcategories are under each one of these. There's a lot more information in your textbook, so do please make sure to utilize those as well as my lecture, because I won't be able to cover every single thing. So we have the first one, nervous tissue. You can see involves internal communication, the brain, the spinal cord, the nerves, things like that. Muscle tissue, of course, causes that movement. So you have the attached to bones, attached to heart, the walls of hollow organs, which is the smooth muscle tissue. So we have the skeletal muscle tissue, the cardiac muscle tissue, and the smooth muscle tissue. We also have epithelial tissue, which helps form boundaries, helps basically protect, secrete, absorb, things like that. You can see it in the lining of the digestive tract, we can see it in glands, we can see it on the skin surface such as the epidermis. There's also connective tissues, and those basically support, protect, bind, things like that. Those are things like the bones, the tendons, and fat and other soft padding as well. And there's going to be more. We're going to talk about blood as well being a tissue too, so that's all over our body. So this is just 4 basic tissue types. When we're looking at tissue, we need to use the microscope. So to be used under the microscope, we have to do a few things first. The first thing is we have to fix the tissue with a solvent. So one, we can't just stick somebody's, stomach tissue under a microscope, right? We have to have a section of it. So we biopsy it or take a piece of it, and we fix that tissue, preserve it with a solvent. After that, we have to section it. We cut it into very thin slices. So basically, we can see through it or push electron, through it, so that we can visualize it. But then we can stain it. That will enhance contrast so that we can see different colors, we can see different artifacts or distortions that are there. And so we can, we can stain it to even look like it would be in a living tissue. If we are using light microscopy, which in a general anatomy and physiology level, we just have a general light microscope, we would use colored dyes. In electron microscopes, we use heavy metal coatings in order to help us see the different features of human tissue under the microscope. So this is what I would look, a comparison of the transmission under transmission and scanning electron microscopes. It's hard to say. So you can see basically this would be under the transmission microscope, which kind of goes, you can see inside of these things, where the scanning, you kind of scan the surface or see the surface. Same image, just looking at different sections of that same type of tissue. So the first tissue that we're going to talk about is epithelial tissue. Sometimes we just say epithelium. That's the sheet of cells that cover body surfaces or cavities. So epithelial tissue is found everywhere. We have some type of epithelium lining every surface of the body, every cavity of the body. So you're going to find epithelial tissue everywhere. There are 2 main types. There's covering and lining epithelial. You're going to find those on external and internal surface, examples like skin and stuff like that. And then there's glandular epithelia. That's basically secretory tissue in glands. Think of salivary glands and things like that. The main function of epithelial tissue is protection, absorption, excretion, secretion, and sensory reception. So it does a lot. Protection is probably the one thing we can think of really the most, because if you look at your skin right now, that's an epithelial tissue, and it's protecting your inside from all this dangerous stuff that's bombarding it on the outside. But it does a lot more than that too. There's some characteristics of epithelial tissue, a couple, and we'll kind of go through some of these. Polarity is one. So cells have polarity, so there's top and bottom. We have an apical surface. That's that free upper side, which is exposed surface or cavity. So most apical surfaces are smooth, but some have sort of finger-like projections that we've talked about in previous chapters called microvilli to help increase surface area. There's also a basal surface. That's the lower attached side that fits inside the body. And we call what the attachment the basal lamina. So the basal surface attaches to the basal lamina. So the basal lamina is just an adhesive sheet that holds the basal surface of the epithelial cells to the underlying cells. So both surfaces actually differ in structure and function. So here, what you see is in this stained slide of epithelium. So these are the epithelial cells. You see a bunch of them. There's an epithelial cell, there's an epithelial cell, so on and so on. And so what you see is this is the apical surface. That's that bordering that open space on the outside. And down here is that basal surface. So this is an epithelial cell here. Down here is the basal surface that's underlying connecting to this connective tissue down there. So basal surface here, apical surface here. So it's basically two different functions that's going to sort of be produced there. Another special characteristic is its specialized contacts. So epithelial tissues have to fit close together because they need to form a continuous sheet. I mean, look at your skin. Your skin is just a bunch of different cells very close together, but they need to fit very close together, otherwise we'd have holes, right? So basically we have to form these sheets. So in order to do that, we have these special contact points that bind cells together. And these are just like little adjacent, each cell that's sitting next to each other can stick together. These lateral contacts include things called tight junction and desmosomes. And so those help keep those together. Another characteristic of epithelial tissue is that it's supported by connective tissue. So all epithelial sheets are supported by some kind of connective tissue underneath. So some of it can be reticular lamina, which is deep to basal lamina, and then it consists of this network of collagen fibers. Or there's this basement membrane, which is made up of basal and reticular lamina, and it sort of reinforces that sheet that's made by the epithelium. And so basically that resists stretching and tearing, and it helps define that epithelial tissue boundary. Now the one thing about this, it's interesting, is cancerous cells. So cancerous epithelial cells are not contained by a basement membrane boundary like other cells. It's able to penetrate that boundary and invade underlying tissues, resulting in the spread of cancer. So our normal epithelial cells just kind of stay in check. They're blocked by that basement membrane. It's a boundary and it doesn't cross it. However, if it's a cancer cell, they have the ability to penetrate that boundary with the different mechanisms that they have, that they have, the fact that they can't, we talked about last chapter, they can't undergo apoptosis. And so basically they just penetrate that boundary and spread. But normal cells don't do that. Another special characteristic is regeneration. So epithelial cells have this high regenerative capability. So this is basically stimulated by the loss of the apical basal polarity and broken lateral contacts. So some cells are exposed to friction, some have hostile substances, so think of your skin, and so they result in lots of damage. So they are programmed to be replaced. But to do that, you need to have basically adequate nutrients and a good process of cell division for that to occur. But epithelial tissues are really good at regenerating. You can see that even when you cut your skin, how quickly it can heal. And burn victims, sometimes you need a skin graft to get it going again, but a lot of times a normal burn, your skin will just regenerate over time. Now, we do have some classifications of epithelia. So we have basically by the number of cell layers. So we have simple and stratified. Simple is just this one layer where you have this apical surface on one side and then that cell and then the basal surface on the other. Just one layer. And then, of course, we have stratified. So stratified basically has these multiple layers associated with it. So you can see the difference between simple and stratified there. So you have the apical surface, lots of layers of cells, and then this basal surface underneath. So those are one way to classify that. We can also classify them based on shape. So basically we have a squamous shape or a flat shape that you can have of this epithelial cells. You can also have squares or cuboidal shapes, and then you can have long rectangular shapes that we call columnar. So that's another way to sort of base the classification of epithelium. So we can have a combination of these things too. So one is what we call simple squamous. So that's that one layer with those little squished cells. So basically you find these typically as a single layer of flattened cells. You typically find these in what we call when we get to these in Anatomy 2, the kidney glomulari, the air sacs of the lungs, the lining of the heart, blood vessels, and lymphatic vessels, things like that. That's where you're going to typically find those. Here you can see that air sac of that lung tissue and how you have some of those just single-celled flat cells there to allow that transport, that gas transport. You can have simple cuboidal, which last time we just had this flat cell. Now you can have the squares that's just in a single layer. You typically find these in kidney tubules and ducts and small glands, ovary, surface, things like that. And so here you can kind of see this simple cuboidal epithelium, what it looks like under a microscope in the kidney tubules. So it's very interesting kind of looking at the difference. I mean, look at how different those two are, even though the only difference between them is whether one is squamous and one is cuboidal. And then we have simple columnar. So that one is those rectangle cells, but it's only one layer of them. And so they're simple, but they're big, long. So they're a layer of tall cells, typically for absorption and secretion of mucus, things like that. They are non-ciliated, so they don't have those extra protrusions on them that actually line the digestive tract. Now, there are parts of our digestive tract with different epithelium that have cilia, but this is the one that is located typically in the stomach, in the rectum as well. Gallbladder, excretory ducts, uterine tubes, some regions of the uterus, and so you can see what that looks like under a microscope. So you can see those long tubes there. So that's simple columnar epithelial cells. This is actually what we call goblet cell. We'll talk more about those later, but they're like little mucus-filled goblet cells where mucus kind of hangs in there. Now, we can also have pseudostratified columnar. Pseudostratified still is a single layer of cells, but because there's things like goblet cells and they're being squished, they kind of look multi-layered. So these can be hard to identify, but yeah, we have some of these. They secrete substances like mucus, but basically you find these in the trachea, we find them in the upper respiratory tract. We do find some non-ciliated in male sperm carrying ducts and in the ducts of larger glands. Then we have the stratified squamous. So it's those flat cells, but there's multiple layers of them. These are protecting and things like that, but you're going to find some of these in the lining of the esophagus, the mouth, the vagina, things like that. We could have a keratinized form of this basically on the skin, the epidermis. Now then you also have this transitional. And transitional, it resembles stratified squamous and stratified cuboidal. And sometimes even sort of the columnar, depending on what we're looking at. But basically, these are going to be the lining the ureters, the bladder, and part of the urethra. Basically, it stretches rapidly. So the importance of these is it permits the stored urine to so you can stretch and stretch and stretch without tearing it or distorting it. So it can get bigger, but it can also get smaller and go back to the same size. So we see this, of course, in the urinary system. So that's really important for those. There's also the formation, sort of like how the glands form, so the multicellular exocrine and endocrine glands. So you can kind of see this multicellular epithelial growth, it invaginates down inward into the epithelial sheet. And so you can kind of see that sort of pinched in. So exocrine glands, they retain the connecting cells to form a duct. And so they can have this little cell that forms this little pocket. Endocrine glands, they lose those ducts. They don't have this after development. So they secrete hormones into the intestinal fluid and things like that. So they kind of excrete it out as opposed to having this little sac there. They just sort of excrete. So there's types of these multicellular exocrine glands. So you can see there's this tubular form and the alveolar form. Alveolar are like sacs. So you can see these are sacs and these are more like tubes. And so you can have simple ducts. So you can have simple tubular, which you can find it in the intestinal glands. You can also have simple branched tubular, where you find in the stomach, gastric glands. We also have these compound tubular secretory structures, which you can find in the small intestine, especially in the duodenum. So we call these duodeneal glands. And so you can see they are this, like, even more branched or compound. And these alveolars, you can have simple. And so really there's no important example in humans for these, but you can have these in some animals. But you can also have this simple branched. So these are what you would find in the oil glands. And then, of course, you can have this compound alveolar, which you find in mammary glands. And then you have this one that's kind of a mix. It's a compound tubulo alveolar. And you can find these in the salivary glands. So lots of different types of exocrine glands that we have. And so the mode of secretion, so the merocrine glands, they secrete by exocytosis. So basically they just produce that, it fills that sac, and it moves on out. Whereas in halocrine glands, the entire secretory vesicle ruptures and releases the secretion through those dead fragments. So you can see there's different ways in which that can be excreted. So the second part of this, we're going to talk about connective tissue. So that was epithelial tissue, but connective tissue, it's the most abundant, widely distributed of the primary tissues. It typically its major functions are binding and support, protecting, insulating, storing fuel, transporting substances like blood. So there's four main classes of connective tissue. You have connective tissue proper, cartilage, bone, and blood. So this is sort of a comparison of each of those classes of connective tissue. So connective tissue proper, it has some subclasses. It's got loose connective and dense connective. And lots of different cells associated with it, but fibroblasts, fibrocytes, defense cells, adipocytes are examples of those. They're matrix inside, it's sort of gel-like, and they have some fibers, so like collagen, reticular, and elastic fibers. Cartilage has some subclasses of haline cartilage, elastic, and fibro. Gel-like substance in there as well, and of course, fibers are things like collagen and things like that. Bone tissue is the next, and its subclasses are compact bone or spongy bone. We'll get to that, and that will be chapter 6. But basically, the cell types there are osteoblasts and osteocytes. We'll talk more about them when we get there. And blood, which won't be until chapter 17, and basically anatomy 2. Basically, we have the red blood cells and the white blood cells. Blood is formed within the bones, but basically it is also that connective tissue. Lots of cells, red blood cells, white blood cells, platelets, and so on. So some common characteristics between all these connective tissues, because they're quite diverse. We've had bone, we've had blood, we've had the other connective tissue proper and cartilage as well. And so basically these characteristics that are similar. They all have this common embryonic origin. So they all arise from something called mesenchyme as their tissue of origin. So they have varying degrees of vascularity. So cartilage is avascular, but bone is highly vascularized. So they're varying degrees. And then the cells are typically suspended or embedded in an extracellular matrix. This is a protein sugar mesh. So the matrix supports cells so that they can actually bear weight. So they withstand tension, they endure abuse, that kind of thing. So that's some of those characteristics. So all connective tissues have three main elements. They have a ground substance, they have fibers, and they have cells. The first two elements, ground substance and fibers, together make up the extracellular matrix. So basically, the composition and arrangement of these three elements vary considerably and in basically different types of connective tissue that we're going to see. So connective tissue fibers, there's three types of fibers that provide support. We have collagen, that's very strong, or the strongest, I should say, and most abundant type. It's tough. It provides high tensile strength and is pretty much this very, very strong substance. Elastic fibers, these are a network of long, thin elastin fibers. They allow for lots of stretching and recoil. And then reticular fibers, these are very short and fine, but they're highly branched collagenous fibers. They have a different chemistry, however, from collagen, so even though they're collagenous, don't get them confused. So collagen and reticular fibers are still different, but their branching form and networks, they offer more give, these reticular fibers. So a little bit more give instead of this tensile strength that you see in collagen. Some of the cells of the connective tissues, you might see some words associated with certain cells. Blast, for example, at the end of cells. That's the immature form of a cell that actively secretes ground substance. You can think fibroblasts, which are found in connective tissue proper, chondroblasts, which are found in cartilage, osteoblasts, found in bone, and then hematopoietic stem cells and bone marrow. The word cyte cells, these are mature cells. They're less active form of the blast, but it now becomes part and helps maintain the health of the matrix. So other cell types that you're going to find in connective tissues that we haven't mentioned much of, fat cells, which are going to store nutrients, white blood cells, things like neutrophils, eosinophils, lymphocytes. It's the tissue's response to injury. Mast cells, which initiate inflammatory response, and macrophages, which basically are phagocytic cells that eat dead cells, microorganisms that shouldn't be there. Basically, they function in the immune system. And so this is a sort of model of areolar connective tissue. So you can kind of see there's some fat cells, there's some mast cells, there's some neutrophils, which is a white blood cell, a lymphocyte, which is also a white blood cell, another macrophage cell, and then things that break down and eat things. So you can see all kinds of different cell types in this connective tissue. And you have some ground substance kind of floating all between in this extracellular matrix with collagen fibers and reticular fibers and elastic fibers. So lots of different cells, capillaries, ground substance with different types of fibers. So very, very robust and lots of things that kind of support it and go on there. So this is just because there's so many of these. This is an overview of the types of connective. So here's a connective tissue. We've got connective tissue proper, which can be divided into loose and dense. Loose can be divided into areolar, adipose, reticular. The dense side can be divided into regular, irregular, and elastic. We then have cartilage as a type of connective tissue, which can be broken down into haline, elastic, and fibrocartilage. Then we have bone and blood. So you can see connective tissue is very complex. Lots of different parts of connective tissue that basically is involved in, keeping our body going and what we do. So connective tissues, this is tissue proper, loose areolar. You can kind of see what that looks like under a photomicrograph. Basically, it wraps and cushions the organs, typically found in the epithelium in the body, mucous membranes, around organs, around capillaries. That's where you're going to find this. You can kind of see there's the epithelium, and then there's the lamina that's below that. Then you have this adipose tissue. So basically you can see what that looks like under a microscope. Of course, reserves food, also provides protection and for heat loss as well. Located under the skin, and so you can kind of see that adipose tissue underneath the skin there. Pretty much found in lots of different areas as well. Okay, this is reticular. Reticular, you can kind of see under that electron microscope, found in organs like the lymph nodes, the bone marrow, the spleen. Basically helps form a soft internal skeleton and sort of supports other cell types like blood cells and mast cells and macrophages and things like that. This is dense regular tissue. You can see that different structure there. Basically, you're going to find that in tendons and ligaments. And of course, it attaches muscles to bone. Or I should say muscles to bones or to muscles. And of course, attaches bone to bone. It can withstand great tensile stress, a pulling force when applied in a direction. And then we have this irregular tissue. And of course, that withstands tension extended in many directions. So it's typically found in the capsules of fibrous capsules of organs and joints, the skin, things like that. And then we have this elastic tissue. Of course, allows the tissue to recoil after stretching. You're going to find these in the arteries, in the ligaments associated with the vertebral column, within the bronchial tubes, places like that. This is the haline cartilage. Basically, you can see what that looks like under the microscope. You see the matrix that's associated, and then this chondrocyte in what we call the lacuna. This basically supports and reinforces surfaces, sort of as a cushion, helps relieve some of that compressive stress. So you're going to find those in the most of the embryonic skeleton, but it covers long bones and joint cavities, and basically the ribs and cartilage in the nose, the trachea, and the larynx, and so on. And this elastic cartilage here typically maintains shape of a structure, so you're going to find this things in like the ear, and so basically, or the external ear, I should say. And you can see what that looks like. So it helps maintain straight structure as well as flexibility. In the fibrocartilage, basically you can see what that looks like under the microscope here. You're going to find this in the intervertebral discs, the pubic symphysis, discs of the knee joint. It has tensile strength, so it allows it to absorb and compress shock. So that's really important. One thing is avascular cartilage actually loses the ability to divide as we age, so injuries heal more slowly. This actually happens in people with sports injuries because they have repetitive injuries a lot. So later in life, cartilage can calcify or ossify, basically becoming bony, causing the chondrocytes to die. And this can create problems, such as not only healing problems, but also makes it more painful over time. So bone tissue, of course, like we said, bone is a tissue. It supports and protects. Obviously, bone is found in the bone. And so basically you can see the structure of this bone here is a very characteristic look under the microscope. You can kind of see this cross-sectional view. You always have these little, what we call lacunae, which are these little round things with a central canal where blood and stuff runs through that. And then blood, of course, basically it transports the respiratory gases, nutrients, waste, all of that stuff. And then, of course, depending on what type of blood, if you have white blood cells, it's there for protection and the immune system. It's contained within the blood vessels, but formed within the bone. And so you can kind of see different types of blood cells here. These are red blood cells. These guys here are white blood cells. There's lots of different types of white blood cells, so we'll be learning a little bit about that. And part of it is also plasma. So you see in this whitish area, that's the plasma that's located there. The next type of tissue is muscle tissue, and it is highly vascularized. Basically, it's responsible for many, many types of movements. They're composed of these microfilaments that make up actin and myosin proteins that bring about contraction. So we have three types of muscle tissue. We have the skeletal muscle, the cardiac muscle, and the smooth muscle. So the skeletal muscle has these little striations in them. It's part of a muscle fiber, this little right here. There's some nuclei, and you can see those little banding or striations. This is part of voluntary movement. It allows for locomotion, manipulation of the environment, even spatial expression. So that is skeletal muscle that are attached to bones, some of it attached to skin as well. The cardiac muscle, of course, as it contracts, it propels blood into circulation. This is involuntary. So you're going to find this in the walls of the heart. You see some intercalated discs. You do see striations there and the nuclei there, which you see under the microscope. Smooth muscle basically is, you see, not striated. It's kind of the smooth, has some nuclei as well. You mostly find this in the walls of hollow organs, but basically it helps propel substances or objects like food and urine, a baby, in the passageways. This is also an involuntary control. Another tissue type is nervous tissue. The main component of nervous tissue, the brain, the spinal cord, the nerves, it regulates and controls these body functions. It's made up of two specialized cells. One, neurons, which specialize nerve cells, and then there's some supporting cells, and there's a lot of these that support, insulate, and protect the neurons. And so this is nervous tissue. You kind of see the nuclei of some supporting cells. You actually see the body of a neuron here and neuron processes. Of course, the location, brain, spinal cord, nerves. But it transmits electrical signals from receptors to effectors, things like muscles and glands and other supporting cells. And so you're going to see that those function to send signals. They are branching cells, so it's a really interesting cell type, which we'll get to this semester. Now, kind of looking a little bit at tissue repair. When the body's barriers are compromised, you get an inflammatory and immune response, and those are activated. Repair starts very quickly. And so repair is the function of inflammatory process. So inflammation is there to heal. But inflammation, if you have a lot of inflammation, it can hurt and be very painful, and it can kind of over-inflame sometimes. But when we're talking about tissue repair, there's two major ways. There's tissue regeneration and then fibrosis. So regeneration is the same kind of tissue replaces destroyed tissue. So the original function is restored. Like skin tissue, when you cut your hand, it'll grow. And then we also have fibrosis, and that's sort of when the connective tissue replaces destroyed tissue and its original function is lost. This can be quite painful. So first thing that happens is inflammation sets in. So we have this release of inflammatory causes. So if you have a cut or something happens, all of a sudden you have these chemicals that go to the site of what happened. You get this dilation of blood vessels, increase in blood vessel permeability, and then all of a sudden clotting of the blood will occur as your immune system starts kicking in and inflammation starts going. So basically you have this inflammation begin. So trauma, when it happens, that injured tissue cells, mast cells, they release inflammatory chemicals. These inflammatory chemicals will basically make these blood vessels leaky so that your immune response can release these substances. Also, while it allows the white blood cells, the fluid clotting proteins, and all these other things to sort of respond and seep into that injured area. So then clotting will seal off that injured area and prevent bacteria and toxins and other substances from sort of spreading to the rest of the body. And then the surface of the clot exposes to air, it dries and forms a scab. So you can kind of see everything being excreted here, this scab being formed. Then we start having this reorganization that restores the blood supply. So the clot is replaced by this little ingrowth of fragile capillaries that allows for the granulation of tissue. And this restores this vascular supply. So basically, you start seeing macrophages phagocytize dead and dying cells. Surface cells begin to multiply a little faster to sort of help heal that tissue and granulate that tissue. And then what you have is this regenerated epithelium. So the fibrosed area matures and contracts, pulling the margin of the wound together. You might have some epithelium thickening underneath the scab when it detaches, but fully regenerated epithelium with an underlying area of scar tissue sort of results. So a scar may be visible as this sort of white line depending on the severity of that wound. So tissues that regenerate extremely well include things like epithelial tissues, bone, areolar connective, dense irregular connective, and blood-forming tissues. Tissue with some moderate regenerating capability are things like smooth muscle and dense regular connective tissue. Unfortunately, we have some tissues that have virtually no functional regenerative capability. Things like cardiac muscle, nervous tissue of the brain and spinal cord. So new research has shown that cell division does occur, and we're trying to coax this regeneration with medicines or techniques and therapies. But unfortunately, we have a really hard time dealing with cardiac muscle and nervous tissue because it's very hard to heal. So, because it doesn't regenerate. And that makes sense. You know, one of the leading causes of death in the United States is heart disease. And heart disease is made of cardiac muscle, and it doesn't regenerate. So we have a problem treating heart disease because these cells don't heal. So scar tissue is also something that forms in organs, so particularly the heart. So if you have damage to the heart, it can severely impair the function of the heart or any other organ. And so basically, because when scar tissue forms, it doesn't come back to its original function. And so basically what happens is you can cause that organ to basically lose volume capacity. It blocks substances from moving through the organ. Think of clogged arteries and things like that in the heart and arteries. And it may interfere with the ability of muscles to contract or impair nerve transmission. So you can imagine scar tissue that forms in the heart muscle or in the nervous tissue is very dangerous and very painful. All scar tissue is painful, but it's even worse in those areas because it really stops some of that functioning. Okay, so that's a little bit of chapter 4, which covers the different types of tissue. If you have questions, please reach out. Please remember to go through the notes and all the other materials in the class. Otherwise, I will see you in the next chapter, and I hope you have a wonderful day.